Right? So I'm going to give us 5 minutes. Tell us who you are, which country you are from, and the organization you're with. So I'm going to start with this very South African table here.
Okay.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Omhle Chingila, and I'm from the Right to Protest Project, which is housed at the Center for Applied Legal Studies at Wits University.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Busisiwe. I'm also from the Center for Applied Legal Studies in Johannesburg, South Africa. And I work mostly on anti-repression work and protecting civic space.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Yanga Malotana. I am with the Center for Human Rights under the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit.
Morning, everyone. I'm Tariro Sekramai, also with the Center for Human Rights in the Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit.
And we're going to move to this table here.
Bom dia a todos. Aissa Musa, da Comissão Nacional dos Direitos Humanos.
Meu nome é Lídia Gulele, da Associação Moçambicana das Mulheres de Carreira Jurídica.
Bom dia, sou Eulália Ufumani, da Associação Moçambicana das Mulheres de Carreira Jurídica. Obrigada.
Bom dia a todos. O meu nome é Dumek. Eu sou assistente de direitos humanos da Lambda, que é uma organização moçambicana para a defesa das minorias sexuais.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Musa Sifunza from Swaziland. I work with the Labour Front, that is the Trade Union Congress of Swaziland.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Eu chamo-me Samaria Albis, assistente de projetos do FAMOD, Fórum das Associações Moçambicanas de Pessoas com Deficiência. Obrigada.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Winnet Shamiadira, and I am based in Harare, Zimbabwe. I work with an organization called Women African Alliance. We work in at least 15 African countries with women in mining impacted communities. Thank you.
Bom dia. Chamo Rosita Euridio Siweia, Observador das Mulheres. Obrigada.
Bom dia, Bom dia, chamo Joyce Inácio, venho do Observador das Mulheres.
Morning, everyone. I'm Laura Rombiwa from Southern Defenders. I'm based in Harare.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Newton God. I'm a researcher in the field of development studies from the Center for the Studies of Peace, Conflict, and Well-being.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Katindo Mwale from a private law firm called K. Mwale and Company from Lusaka, Zambia.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Amande from Southern Defenders.
Bom dia a todos. Eu sou a Sheila Nhankala, da Rede Moçambicana dos Defensores de Direitos Humanos.
Morning, everybody. My name is Sisanda Mavimbela from an organization called Eswatini Sexual and Gender Minorities.
Bom dia a todos. Chamo-me Crispim Amaral. Sou da Associação para o Estudo e Defesa do Consumidor.
Good morning. My name is Emmanuel Langamandla, representing Multi-Stakeholder Forum. Thank you.
Bom dia a todas e todos. Meu nome é Mirna Chitsungu, sou defensora dos direitos humanos e estou aqui em nome da Rede Moçambicana Defensora dos Direitos Humanos. Obrigada.
Bom dia a todos. Chamo-me Alice Toy e sou do CDD, Centro para a Democracia e Desenvolvimento.
Morning, I'm Tabo Masugu, coming from the Foundation for Socio-Economic Justice in Swaziland.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Simbarashi Tembo. I'm from the University of KwaZulu-Natal.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Erika Base e sou gestora de projeto da Escola de Ativismo.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nabila Mia from Lawyers for Human Rights in South Africa.
Bom dia a todos e a todas. Sou Benil de Manjazi, da União Nacional de Camponeses.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Sou Milda Aquaria Langa, jornalista e ativista social, Centro de Jornalismo Investigativo de Moçambique e Associação Mentes Resilientes.
Bom dia a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Diolene Dimo. Estou aqui em representação ao Observatório de Cidadão para a Saúde.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to allow my panelists to introduce themselves.
Bom dia a todos. Meu nome é Mary Paz da Silva, sou a defensora dos direitos humanos da Suazilândia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tobekile Matimbe, and I work for Paradigm Initiative, a regional-based organization working in Africa, advancing digital rights. Internet freedom is something at the heart of what we do.
Meu nome é João Yamposa, eu sou advogado de direitos humanos, consultor independente. Obrigado.
Thank you so much. And like I said earlier, my name is Bonolo Makale from the University of Pretoria. We're going to move on into a different conversation. We're going to talk about the state of human rights in SADC, and hopefully as a collective explore civil society interventions. Before I hand over to panelists, I want to just make a few remarks that a number of countries in the SADC region are experiencing alarming human rights violations and abuses threatening peace and security. And of special concern are the situations prevailing in Mozambique, Swaziland, and Zimbabwe. And that's why we have our panelists here representing these three countries. In Zimbabwe in particular, there has been human rights violations, including, the right of freedom of expression in recent months, especially targeting journalists, activists, and human rights defenders who have spoken against alleged corruption and called for peaceful protests. Several activists and opposition supporters were also arrested. Others were abducted by the state agents and being suspected of supporting national protests, and this all in Zimbabwe. And in Mozambique in particular, there's an ongoing human rights violation that has resulted in hundreds of deaths and displacement of millions. We have seen security forces in Mozambique clearly overwhelmed by the, what we are seeing in Mozambique at the moment, and which ended up with SADC being mobilized, or rather SADC mobilized in military deployment in the region. And of course, in Swaziland, there has been increasing waves of pro-democracy protests, which have been met by, violence from the king. There's been internet shutdown. Citizens have been attacked by the military. But I think it's also interesting to note, as a by the way comment, and I think this was also a reality during COVID. It exposed how violent, or how violently the state engages with its citizens. We saw this in South Africa, when the military was deployed to ensure that citizens aren't moving around during COVID times. So it's also an interesting conversation that I would want us to have in how the state in itself and ways in which it engages with its citizens, and it engages with citizens by force. As I mentioned earlier, I come from a Christian background, and I always make this example that in theology, there's a thing that they call the hermeneutics of suspicion. And often it's in ways in which you read the text, your interpretation and application of it is with suspicion. And what we have seen is the suspicion that the state has towards its citizens, but not only, and particularly civil society organizations and human rights defenders, but not only the suspicion, the ways in which the state is using force when it comes to citizens. It has been nearly 4 months since the assassination of human rights lawyer Butulane Maseko, and nothing has been done so far. In South Africa, there's recent cases of activists like Londoko Tlemguni, Ayanda Gila, and Nokchola Mabaso that have also been murdered because they were human rights defenders. And of course, because we want to locate this conversation within the frameworks and mechanisms of the Pan-African Parliament and the African Union, I think it's worthwhile noting that the African Union affirms the fundamental importance of freedom of expression and information as an individual right, as a cornerstone of democracy, and as a means of ensuring respect for all human rights. And so I think even when we make these reflections, and I mentioned this earlier, that one of the things that I want to see at the end of this convening tomorrow is that we're going to walk out of this room with an actual statement that will highlight the state of human rights in SADC, and that will call for the Justice and Human Rights Committee of the Pan-African Parliament to respond to it. But I'm not going to take much of your time. I'm now going to invite Mary, who will make a reflection on the state of human rights in Swaziland. And from Mary, we're going to invite, I wrote his name down in Setswana, but it's not a Setswana name, so that I pronounce it well, Yoang, who is also a graduate of this one class, who, 2021, right? Or 22? Yeah, 2021 class, who will make a reflection on Swaziland. So what we'll do, I'll have the panelists share their thoughts. I make intervention after each of their presentation or not, and then we'll open up the floor for questions, interventions, because I do want to see this session being quite interactive. So Mary, I'm going to start with you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks, Bonolo. And I think what I'll speak about Swaziland is quite common across the region, because for a very long time we in Swaziland were a bit insulated from some of the problems that we're seeing across the region, but now it's come to us as well. So what we have seen in Swaziland is the rise in authoritarianism, where the authorities of the country stifle any democratic space. Our civic space has been decreasing over the years, and they continue to close off as much as possible the arenas of engagement for civil society. Oh, they're not interpreting. Is it fine? So I was saying that the civic space has been decreasing, but for you to totally understand Swaziland, it started in 1973. I think in the 1960s, many of our African countries gained independence from our colonial masters, and Swaziland was no exception. We gained our independence in 1968, and with it came a constitution that was agreed upon between the people that lived in the country, between the colonialists and the natives in the country. But in 1973, the king at that time was King Sobhuza. He promulgated what is now known, a proclamation which is now known as the 1973 decree, where he banned all political parties. And we know that political parties are a vehicle for people to voice their concerns, for people to engage in the politics of the country, for people to engage in the socio-economic issues in the country. And by banning political parties, he effectively banned political participation. So with it, he banned the freedom of expression, the freedom of association and assembly. And for a very long time, Swazis have been in a struggle for democracy. And our struggle has had many phases in it, wherein, of course, in any struggle, there are times when your struggle is at a high, and then at times it's at such a low that we all then think that there is no struggle in Swaziland. And with the coming into force of the new constitution in 2005, there was a Bill of Rights, like in most constitutions around the world. First and foremost, it's important to note that our constitution clearly says that Swaziland is a democratic country. On paper, that's what it says. And it's a beautiful thing, because even the Bill of Rights, you really cannot fault it that much, because it recognizes the rights that we have, but with the normal restrictions, the international and regionally recognized restrictions around issues of public interest and national security. But on paper, then you look at the 1973 decree, that's the one that is in force. Because when you want to enforce your freedom of expression, as per the constitution we have now, the reason why it is stifled, because the powers that were given to security forces back then in 1973 still exist. So we have a situation where you have a constitution that is called the supreme law of the land, but then you still have a decree that coexists, and the decree is above the constitution when it comes to application. So as I was saying, we've had phases. And in these phases, we've had, many activists or human rights defenders being killed. But, they would be killed in an isolated manner, in such that people were not able to link the killing of that person to the activism of that person. But in 2021, in June, in the backdrop of COVID-19 and the economic problems that came with it, and people seeing that they are living in abject poverty, while the king and the royal family and those close to them were living a lavish lifestyle, the people decided it was time to begin speaking about these issues, to be vocal about them. But the catalyst came when a young man was killed, a student was killed by the police, and this in our country is normal. Police kill people and get away with it. Extrajudicial killings and get away with it with impunity. They are never held accountable. Even if a commission of inquiry is held, they are never held accountable for their acts. Rather, you see them, the worst that happens is that they are transferred to another police station and they continue working in the service. So in June, this young man was killed in May. And as students stood up and began agitating for accountability for his death, it resonated with the rest of the populace to say, this is not just about accountability for the death of a young person. It's about accountability for everything that is going wrong in the country. Accountability for lack of service delivery, accountability for corruption, accountability for the deplorable state of the health system, the education system, and so on and so forth. And the calls for democratic change got louder and louder. In the midst of this, there were members of parliament as well that were talking to the issues from a different context, though, in parliament, where they were agitating for the election of a prime minister by the people's choice, rather than being appointed by the king. So as everyone is getting into the movement to say from whichever perspective you come from, whether you're from the health sector, you're from the education sector, or basically you are a political activist, there was a moment of convergence, there was a moment of synergy where everyone found each other. So there broke out protests. There were service deliveries, petition deliveries around the constituencies where we supposedly elect our MPs from, our members of parliament from. Then the government made the biggest mistake of banning the petition deliveries, to say, because the members of parliament were now agitating in parliament, so government was asking these members of parliament where they were deriving their authority to raise these issues. Then the people responded by taking the petitions to their members of parliament in the constituencies. Then government came out to ban the petition delivery. And this is a people that is now so frustrated, there's no going back. So we had countrywide protests, not just in the urban areas, even in the rural areas where the regime thought they had a stronghold. You had the ordinary rural communities protesting and calling for democratic change, democratic reforms. And for the first time in our history, the army was sent out to handle protests. We all know police are the ones with the mandate and the authority to handle riots or protests because they are supposedly trained in civic engagement. The army is not trained to engage with civilians. The army is trained to shoot to kill. They're not there to maintain order. They are there literally to fight a war. So more than 100 people were killed. Many of them, not even those that were protesting, many of them were caught in between leaving home, going to work, or coming back from work, children going to the shop and stuff like that. So with the people that were killed, it included women, it included children. So you can see how indiscriminate it was. It wasn't only aimed at those that were protesting or those that were supposedly said to be looting. On top of the people that were killed, they were not just shot at, others were thrown into fires in different parts of the country, but mostly in Matapa and in Nhlangano. They were burnt alive. The level of atrocities we witnessed have never been witnessed before. We would always see it happening in other countries. We never thought it would happen with us. More than 700 were arrested, charged. I think I remember in 2018, 2019, Tobegile in Zimbabwe, were you having this fast tracking of cases so that people could be quickly convicted, pay a fine or sentenced. We were seeing that happening. And more than 200 injured one way or another, with some of them having to have their limbs amputated because of the nature of their injuries. Till today, we still have people who've got bullets, live bullets in their bodies. Because what the police were doing was going to the hospitals to identify people who had been shot during the unrest, to retrieve those bullets so that they could get rid of the evidence. And in the middle of this, of course, civil society came together to respond to the issue. And of course, when you say civil society, you know that it's not just the organizations that will stand. There were a few individuals that came together, brainstormed, and then decided to form some kind of coalition. First, the coalition was meant to address the needs, the immediate needs of burying the people that had been killed, of medical service for those that had been injured, legal representation for those that had been arrested. But this then turned into something bigger than just responding to the crisis. It now led to the formation of, it began the formation of what we call the Multi-Stakeholder Forum, which is now in the middle of calling for negotiations and dialogue in the country to say that's the only way forward. I want to move from that one to talk about the targeted attacks. They have increased since 2021 because these leaders that have come to the fore to assist with the crisis have been targeted. Either they're being threatened, their lives are being threatened, or they've been arrested, they've been killed. Others attempted assassinations of them. I'll make just but a few examples. I've already said the members of parliament were arrested. They are languishing in jail right now under trumped up charges that in any court, any properly constituted court would not hold any water. Others are also facing charges, they're out on bail. Others have gone into exile for fear of being arrested and facing too many years in jail without any way forward, or being killed. We've had some of them killed as well. We've had, the most prominent one was Tulani, but he's not the only one. There are others that have been killed who are less known than he is. We've had attempted assassinations of leaders of political parties, and also a member of the legal response team that was assisting the people during the unrest. So by putting your head on the block, in doing the work that you do as an HRD, in whichever format that you do it, it paints a target on you. So while we're trying to protect the next person, you also now need protection. You also now need assistance and support. We've had abductions. You know, they abduct, especially the young activists, take them, assault them, torture them. If they're lucky, they're released. If not, their bodies are found somewhere. We've got enforced disappearances for a number of days with no account for what's happening. You know, I've also mentioned the issues of extrajudicial killings that have happened. And there's also the issue of sexual and gender-based violence in the middle of this. We are talking people that are state actors and non-state actors. Because we know that in a situation of anarchy, there are those that will take advantage of the situation. During the unrest, women could not access sexual reproductive health care because the soldiers are in our communities, they are in our streets, there was a curfew. You could only travel if it's an emergency. Where are you going? I'm going to the clinic, and this is a man with a gun, a soldier with a gun. What are you going to the clinic? I think you'd rather go back home than answer too many questions from him. Issues of rape were insinuated but not formally reported because people are afraid of the reprisals that go with that. I remember one of the leading HRDs was pregnant, and they shot at her straight on her stomach with a tear gas canister. So that's the kind of situation that we are facing. There was a time in our country, in as much as GBV is a problem in our country, but women, it was rare for security personnel to literally target women during a protest. Now they don't care, woman or not, child or not. Everybody is a target and everybody faces that. And the last thing that I want to talk to is the fact that, with all the protests and the curfews that were put in place, because we were out of the COVID era of the curfew that said you had to, close at a certain time. A curfew of 6 p.m. was then imposed. And businesses were told shut down at 3 p.m. to allow people to get home and everything like that. And in the midst of all this, you are not able to move, you're not able to hold meetings, you're not able to engage with other colleagues or comrades and mobilize and organize around these issues. Even issues like, Thabo was one of the people that was instrumental in getting autopsies, getting independent pathologists into the country to conduct autopsies on those that had been killed. And getting around the country was difficult. Contacting each other was difficult. They shut down the internet because we're using the internet, we're using social media to mobilize, to organize each other. We're using the media to also report on what was happening. The reports were too many. If anyone was sitting on a call, they wouldn't have handled the volume. And we were also using social media to document what was happening, to say, we may not be able to get into the offices and document, let's put it on social media, and we know, you see your memories on Facebook after a year or so, so we're able to retrieve kind of like an archive situation. They shut down the internet to hide what they were doing and to disrupt us from continuing with the activism. But then after a while, it stopped being a total shutdown. They would shut down specific social media platforms. And I know many HRDs are not aware of it, but they throttle our internet, They throttle it. Sometimes it's slower than usual when they're up to their nefarious deeds. And I think, so one of the other things that we have to engage in as civil society is to invest in proper technological software that will allow us to maneuver around these things. There are apps that will allow us to do that. You've got your VPNs, you've got your probes that will tell you what they are throttling at that time or what they are shutting down at that time. And I think for the first time, we are receiving the kind of attention that we haven't received in a long, like I'm saying, we started in 1970, well, our parents started in 1973. Started in 1973 over the years. And it has to be a cause for concern for the region that the most peaceful country, which the country that has been described as the most peaceful country, has gotten to this stage. if the country that was said to be the most peaceful in the region is at this stage, what of those countries that have always been in crisis mode? Those countries where we know that violations have been happening with impunity over the years. And I think this is where we come in as civil society and the interventions that we have in the collaborative strategies that we put together, in the solidarity that we give to each other. Not solidarity only by writing statements condemning this and writing statements condemning that and calling for this, but also people-to-people solidarity. I think we've missed it a bit. We've lost that. We've lost the people-to-people solidarity. While, of course, we do not want to increase the risk for other human rights defenders, but there are very few countries that will target human rights defenders from another country when they provide solidarity to their own citizens, because then it constitutes an international incident that they do not want to get embroiled in. So for me, as I end, to say that we have received quite a lot of solidarity, particularly from the countries that are present in this room today. And we also, while we request for solidarity, we also pledge solidarity in return, because we cannot expect to be supported and fold our arms when perhaps Tobegile is in dire straits and needs assistance from me. I think for now I'll end it there to say the problems that we're seeing in Swaziland are problems that have been seen in Africa, not just the region, Africa as a whole. And instead of there being mitigating factors being put in place and things improving, we are just digressing as a continent and getting worse. And our democracy, Afrobarometer has said, democracy on the continent is on the backslide. It's getting worse instead of improving. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. While you were talking about the people-to-people solidarity, it actually made me remember how, as a continent, we came together during Zimbabwe Lives Matter, for an example, hashtag #EndSARS in Nigeria. There was a strong sense of solidarity, and I think that's important, that there are creative ways in which we could organize and mobilize, right? But also even just ways in which we use social media. And I think that's one of the first places the state will go, will shut down the internet as to contravene the right to access to information and freedom of expression. But there's something that you said also that I thought was very important, that the existence of a constitution does not necessarily guarantee constitutionalism. And I think that's what we see not only in Swaziland, and we see the same in Zimbabwe. We see the same in South Africa, a country that has been celebrated to have the best constitution in the world, but yet we remain a very unequal state. So the fact that there is a constitution does not necessarily mean that it guarantees constitutionalism. Thank you so much for your interventions, greatly appreciated. I'm going to hand over to Joang to reflect on Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonola. I'm going to speak in Portuguese. I'm home, by the way. Mais uma vez, bom dia a todos. Bem, depois da intervenção da Mary Paz da Silva, que é da Suazilândia, não sei por que é da Silva, sendo da Suazilândia, uma intervenção muito eloquente e exaustiva. Na verdade, o que eu devia fazer era só mudar o nome da Suazilândia para Moçambique e minha intervenção estava completa, né? Uma espécie de copy and paste, né? Bem, entrando numa dimensão moçambicana, na verdade eu não consegui preparar uma apresentação em tanto que tal, então eu vou falar de improviso. Mas falando de improviso, eu ia começar por descrever a situação de direitos humanos em Moçambique numa dimensão, primeiro, do ponto de vista metodológico, numa dimensão institucional, não é? O que nós temos em Moçambique do ponto de vista institucional relativamente à defesa, à proteção de direitos humanos? Aqui nós temos no topo, em primeiro lugar, nós temos os tribunais. Temos os tribunais com destaque para o Conselho Constitucional, que lida com matéria de direitos humanos, direitos constitucionais, e o Tribunal Administrativo também, que lida muito com questões relativamente a direito público. No entanto, os tribunais constituem o último recurso ao qual o cidadão se socorre, não é? Mas está lá, é o topo, do ponto de vista institucional. Fora os tribunais, nós temos algumas instituições específicas de proteção de direitos humanos, quais sejam a Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos. Nós temos uma Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos. Se funciona ou não, esse é outro debate. O que eu estou a dar aqui a entender é o quadro institucional que temos. Temos a Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos. Para além da Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos, temos o provedor de justiça, que também tem um mandato para proteger a justiça e os direitos humanos. Para além da Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos e provedor da justiça, temos o Ministério da Justiça. No organograma do Ministério da Justiça, temos lá uma Direção Nacional de Direitos Humanos. Então, o próprio Ministério da Justiça tem uma Direção Nacional de Direitos Humanos, e quando Moçambique vai se representar na Comissão Africana dos Direitos Humanos dos Povos, a nível das Nações Unidas também, faz-se representar através do Ministério da Justiça. Então, do ponto de vista governamental, o Ministério da Justiça é o nosso representante relativamente aos direitos humanos. Então, é por isso que chamo aqui este Ministério para o nosso quadro institucional. Também temos o Parlamento. Dentro do Parlamento, que são os representantes do povo, a soberania reside no povo, como se diz, mas nós entregamos a eles o nosso poder para nos representar. Se fazem bem ou não, como disse, este é outro debate. Dentro da comissão, dentro do Parlamento, temos lá a primeira comissão. Penso que todos aqui, pelo menos os moçambicanos, conhecem a primeira comissão, que está ligada à constitucionalidade e direitos humanos. Muitos de nós, sobretudo as mulheres, que advogam pelos direitos das mulheres, quando querem fazer lobbies, se aprova ou não aprova uma lei, é com esta comissão que vão tratar muitas das vezes, não é verdade? Então, temos no Parlamento uma comissão que trata dos direitos humanos e constitucionalidade. Para além disso, temos a Ordem de Advogados. A Ordem de Advogados também, que é um guardião dos direitos humanos, do qual sou membro, e dentro da Ordem temos uma Comissão de Direitos Humanos também, ok? Temos uma Comissão de Direitos Humanos dentro da Ordem de Advogados. Para além dessas instituições públicas de que falei, temos organizações da sociedade civil, que são variadas em todo o país. Temos várias organizações da sociedade civil que tratam da matéria de direitos humanos. Alguém falava da Lambda ali, é uma organização de direitos humanos. Este evento é organizado por uma rede que congregam organizações e defensores de direitos humanos. Nesta sala, do ponto de vista local, em Moçambique, temos aqui representantes de várias organizações da sociedade civil que lidam com direitos humanos de várias naturezas, criança, mulher, deficiente, por aí fora. Então, para dizer, essas organizações não temos, que tratam de homens, os homens tratam-se de per si, desde logo. Temos várias organizações da sociedade civil que tratam de direitos humanos em todo o país. Por que eu trouxe essa dimensão institucional? Para vocês verem que não temos um problema de instituição em Moçambique. Não há um déficit de direitos humanos do ponto de vista institucional em Moçambique. Temos tudo. Temos tudo para proteger, promover, defender os direitos humanos em Moçambique do ponto de vista institucional. Ora, essa era a minha primeira dimensão. A segunda dimensão é a dimensão legal. Na dimensão legal, eu vou começar desde a própria Constituição da República. Na Constituição da República nós temos uma espécie de Carta dos Direitos Humanos, Carta dos Direitos e Liberdades Fundamentais. Estão lá. Qualquer um que quer saber os seus direitos e liberdades fundamentais vai para a Constituição da República e lá encontra. Então, é o primeiro instrumento legal em Moçambique que protege os direitos humanos e está em vigor. Constituição da República de Moçambique. Fora a Constituição, vamos encontrar também um leque de leis ordinárias que também defendem os direitos humanos, seja na área da criança, da mulher, dos deficientes, conforme eu estava a dizer, direito de família, por aí fora. Temos variada legislação de proteção de direitos humanos. E nisto ainda, Moçambique ratificou uma série de instrumentos internacionais de proteção de direitos humanos, para dizer que, do ponto de vista legal, também não temos um déficit relativamente à proteção dos direitos humanos. Agora, o que é que um país precisa? Temos instituições, temos leis. Agora, se temos instituições, temos leis que protegem direitos humanos, a questão que fica é, temos direitos humanos? Aqui, essa questão me leva para uma dimensão política. A dimensão política, aqui começa o problema, porque apesar de todas as leis em Moçambique, quem faz o país seguir ou recuar são os políticos. É o governo. O governo que, no fundo, tem mentes políticas, não é? Tem mentes políticas. Vivem de prometer. E nós gostamos de promessas, ok? Nós gostamos de promessas. Vamos prometer, neste mandato vou fazer isso, vou fazer aquilo, até terminar o mandato é quando a gente acorda. Afinal, isso não aconteceu. Por quê? Na área de direitos humanos, por exemplo, em Moçambique, nós não temos uma política pública. Uma política pública devidamente elaborada e implementada de direitos humanos. Não há política de direitos humanos em Moçambique. Nós não temos uma visão de direitos humanos em Moçambique. A Constituição diz que nós somos um Estado de Direito, mas eu sou uma das pessoas que defende que Moçambique devia evoluir para um Estado de direitos humanos. Porque direitos humanos, tendo em conta a sua dimensão, acaba abarcando tudo. A própria justiça a qual almejamos. Então, aqui começa o problema. Se temos um déficit de visão de direitos humanos, se não temos uma política nacional efetiva de direitos humanos, começamos a ter um problema de direitos humanos na vida real. Porque são estes que conduzem o país. Direitos humanos na vida real. O que acontece hoje? Com toda esta panóplia de que falei, institucional, legal e política, quando a gente olha o país, hoje em dia, em Moçambique, ninguém, mas ninguém pode manifestar-se. Ninguém pode exercer o direito à manifestação sob pena de ver a sua integridade física violada, a sua vida violada. Ninguém pode. Então, o que é que os políticos fizeram? Institucionalizaram em Moçambique um estado de medo. Nós agora temos medo. Temos medo de exercer nossos direitos. Temos medo dos direitos humanos em Moçambique. Porque ninguém ousa manifestar-se. Ninguém ousa em Moçambique falar nas redes públicas, estou a falar de imprensa, estou a falar de redes sociais, ao vivo, dar a cara, como eu estou a fazer aqui. Quantos de nós têm coragem de ir à televisão, pegar o microfone, em público, sem medo de ninguém, e falar sobre direitos humanos? Ninguém. Falamos no café, falamos no bar, falamos na família, falamos no chitique, não é assim? Ah, mas esse país não está bom, esse país aqui. Mas quem é que vai com coragem ir falar? Ninguém, por causa do medo. Nós estamos com medo, mas estamos com medo de nós mesmos, ok? Temos medo da mudança, temos medo da revolução. Quando morreu a Zagaia, toda a gente saiu naquele dia, aquela semana. Povo no poder, povo no poder. Quem é que diz povo no poder hoje? Estamos todos encolhidos. Alguns levaram porrada, outros perderam o olho. Quem é que sai? Todos ficamos nas redes sociais, no Facebook, WhatsApp. Povo no poder, povo no poder. Quem é agora que sai e fala com voz de coragem, com voz de autoridade, Ninguém. Então, esta é que é a realidade dos direitos humanos em Moçambique, em que os direitos políticos e civis estão limitados. Mas estão limitados por quê? Para além de se institucionalizar o medo, Moçambique, é verdade, na Constituição diz que somos um Estado de direito democrático, mas do ponto de vista prático, somos uma ditadura, somos um Estado autoritário. Então, com o autoritarismo, ninguém se atreve a enfrentar o poder do dia. Ontem celebrava-se o Dia Internacional, né? Não sei se é internacional, da liberdade, não é? E quem estava a discutir sobre a liberdade de imprensa ontem? Quem? A não ser ouvirmos um discurso do Presidente da República. É preciso que os órgãos de comunicação social... Nós estamos ali todos a bater palmas. Mas quem que estava a debater liberdade de imprensa ontem? Ninguém. Ninguém estava a reivindicar liberdade de imprensa. Temos jornalistas que desapareceram, que pereceram em Cabo Delgado, a cobrir o terrorismo em Cabo Delgado. Para trabalhar em Cabo Delgado, o Naldo está ali, tem a experiência sobre isso, para trabalhar em Cabo Delgado como jornalista, exercer o direito à liberdade de imprensa, para ter liberdade de informar e ser informado, não é fácil. Não é fácil aqui em Moçambique. Então, na realidade, os nossos direitos estão inibidos. Esta também era uma dimensão dos direitos políticos e civis. Mas os direitos humanos é muito mais do que os direitos políticos e civis. Os direitos económicos, sociais e culturais. Aqui em Moçambique, hoje, nos debatemos com o problema do TSU, que achamos que não é nada, mas o TSU está a afetar nossas famílias. Não conseguimos pagar a escola. A educação em Moçambique está muito mal. Está mal por quê? Porque sabotaram a escola pública, sabotaram a educação pública. Qualquer pai, qualquer mãe hoje faz todo o esforço para matricular o filho na escola privada. Por que matricular na escola privada? Porque é negócio dos grandes. É onde a gente acha que a criança vai ter o mínimo de educação. Mas para teu filho, tua filha estar na escola privada, tens de pagar mensalmente. E o dinheiro não é pouco, é muito. Os livros não chegam a tempo, os livros estão errados, então há um programa já muito avançado de sabotagem da educação pública em Moçambique. Um direito humano básico. Um país sem escola é uma lástima. Um país sem escola é uma lástima. Fora isso, a saúde também está mal. Se sairmos um pouco, está cheio de lixo no país, problema de saúde pública, não é verdade? O país também é conhecido como o boom dos recursos minerais. Não temos uma única comunidade em Moçambique cujas vidas melhoraram em função de exploração de recursos minerais. Então, de que nos vale esses rubis? Do que nos vale o ouro? Do que nos vale o carvão mineral? Do que nos vale o gás? Se o tal gás, o tal carvão mineral, o tal rubi, o tal ouro significa usurpação de terra das comunidades, significa reassentamentos injustos. É o que nós estamos a ver hoje. Temos vários casos em Moçambique, todo o país. Moçambique felizmente, tem recursos como se diz? Em toda a extensão nacional, toda, não há província que não tem recursos minerais ou naturais. Fora isso, temos terra. Moçambique tem cerca de 36 milhões de terra arável. Nós exploramos mais de 10. E andamos a lutar para a terra aqui em Maputo. Andamos a dizer que temos 3 refeições quando não temos. Ok? Andamos com programas, está na Constituição, a agricultura é a base de desenvolvimento, mas nós estamos a sair para, como se diz isso? Como é que se diz isso? Africa-America Meeting, African-China Meeting, para pedir dinheiro, mas nós temos recursos que não exploramos. Moçambique tem uma costa inacabável para o turismo. Moçambique tem quase todo tipo de... Como é que se diz isso? Tem todo tipo... Não, eu falo de mariscos, não é? Todo tipo de espécie marinha. Quer peixe, quer camarão, Moçambique tem tudo isso. Vegetais que não acabam. Por que nós passamos fome? Então, esta é a vida real. São os direitos humanos na realidade em Moçambique. Direitos econômicos e sociais problemáticos, direitos políticos e civis problemáticos. Cultura, direitos culturais. Danone, vocês conhecem Danone? Criança, fizeram uma peça teatral, uma questão turística, não turística, como é que é? Artística. Crianças foram julgadas em Moçambique por causa de representação cultural, a criticar o sistema governamental. Crianças foram julgadas. Então, há uma proibição da liberdade cultural. A polícia emitiu um despacho, um decreto, a proibir qualquer representação cultural usando a farda da polícia. Mas é representação cultural, quer dizer, já não podemos criticar a polícia usando a farda. Não é para extorquir o cidadão, é para representar a polícia. Eu posso pôr uma bata como a representar o médico, a representar o professor. Então, mesmo questões culturais, estamos a ser banidos. E perante tudo isto, perante esse todo tipo de violação, o que nos resta? Resta-nos a mudança, resta-nos reclamar, resta-nos lutar. Mas será que temos coragem? E toda a gente olha direitos humanos como uma matéria da sociedade civil. Não é matéria da sociedade civil, é primeiramente matéria das instituições públicas. Mas essa sociedade civil de hoje consegue lutar pelos direitos humanos? Aqui temos outro problema. A sociedade civil de hoje luta pelo protagonismo. A sociedade civil de hoje está a lutar pelos mesmos fundos. Temos uma guerra dos fundos. Estamos a lutar pelo mesmo parceiro. Temos uma agenda, o parceiro diz não, faz assim. Temos que fazer da maneira que o parceiro quer. Temos que lutar as lutas dos nossos parceiros, não as nossas lutas. Porque nós não temos coragem da mudança. E por quê? Porque não temos dinheiro. Nós temos que fazer aquilo que o fundo manda. Mas esta é outra conversa sobre os fundos que vamos ter. O meu tempo acho que já vai escasso, mas dá-me pelo menos 2 minutos. Então, é preciso que tenhamos um ativismo sério. O que é ativismo sério? Para além de falarmos, reclamar, é preciso usar as instituições de direitos humanos do que eu falei. No dia 18 de março, foi 18 de março, né? Março sobre a Zagaia, tentamos manifestar, fomos rebentados, fomos violados, gás lacrimogêneo de qualquer maneira, agredidos fisicamente. Esta semana, se não estou erro, é na marcha. Nós estamos a partilhar vídeos no WhatsApp. Vê lá o que a polícia fez. Vê lá o que a polícia fez. Mas ninguém está a tomar atitude. Quantas organizações de direitos humanos nós temos aqui em Moçambique? Nenhuma foi para o tribunal. Nenhuma pôs em prática litigância de interesse público contra os agressores, contra o Estado, contra o governo, contra a polícia, contra o município. Ninguém conseguiu levar os infratores à barra da justiça. Por quê? Temos medo. Por quê? Porque é mais cômodo fazer statements. É mais cômodo fazer comunicado de imprensa. Não é? A organização da sociedade civil X condena veementemente a atitude da polícia. E acabou por aí. Partilha ali, WhatsApp ali. Acabou. Como é que se usa tribunal, senhores? Como é que se usa a Comissão Nacional de Direitos Humanos? Estamos a dizer, não faz nada, você vai queixar. Como é que se responsabiliza essa gente? Como é que se usa o provedor de justiça? Como é que se usa o parlamento que nós demos poder a eles? Como é que se usa o Ministério da Justiça? Como é que se usa a Ordem dos Advogados de Moçambique? Nós nos acomodamos no conforto do Facebook, de grupos de WhatsApp, para partilhar comunicado de imprensa. Tá bonito. Não que seja mal, mas depois do comunicado de imprensa, what else? O que é que se faz? Muito obrigado.
Thank you so much. while I was listening to you speaking and making reflections about human rights bodies and institutions that exist in your country that activists can utilize to amplify human rights violations, I actually, and here's a question that I'm going to ask you in particular, and this is true for my country, and for other countries, particularly in South Africa. The recent Freedom House report noted that we have one of the best democratic systems in Africa from a formal democracy point of view, right? Issues around separation of power, and we always have free and fair elections, apparently. But when you think about the quality of democracy and how it is experienced by citizens, it looks different, right? So we have best constitutions in place, we've got courts, we've got human rights bodies, but I'm wondering where the gap is. And I'm making an example with my country because that's my reality, but just listening to you, I'm wondering what is it that we are missing that we can do? What are some of the most creative interventions that we could employ? And I get the social media activism because it's easy, right? We are hiding behind our phones and we are hiding behind our computers, but also it's effective. We saw it being effective. It has been effective. We saw it being effective during COVID. But how do we move, and Mary touched on that as well, and maybe this is not just a question for you, how do we move from spaces where we write statements? I come from an organization where I'll probably get in trouble for this, but we are always releasing statements, and sometimes when I'm asked to release statements, I will mize my bosses because I'm just like, after we release the statements, what do we do? Then what happens? So I think this is something that we can think about, that what are some of the sustainable interventions that we could employ? Because the institutions are there that we could use, the courts are there, but also in countries like Zimbabwe, with institutions that are there are owned by ZANU-PF. I'd also like to hear your reflection on this topic. So I don't know if you want to answer this question now. I don't even know if it's a question. I know I've been rambling, but I wonder if you get my point.
Thank you, Bonano, for your question. Back again, I will speak in Portuguese. As I told you, I'm home. Eu penso que uma das questões que eu coloquei na minha intervenção e Bonolo volta a retorquir como uma pergunta e ela dá exemplo do país que ele viu nascer, Botswana, em que nós até dizemos, né, nos relatórios, como ela falou do Freedom House, em que tem melhor democracia e a própria organização onde ela trabalha faz muitos comunicados de imprensa, não é? Nota de imprensa para cá, para repudiar os direitos humanos. Mas a questão que se coloca e depois? Para onde é que nós vamos? Mas ela, como dizia, no próprio país dela, em Botswana, tem várias instituições de direitos humanos. Oh, sorry. I met you in Botswana, so I look at you as a Tswana. Então, temos várias instituições e África do Sul, por exemplo, é um dos exemplos de sociedade civil vibrante. Eu conheço algumas decisões do Tribunal Constitucional da África do Sul sobre os direitos humanos, que quem levou o caso para lá foram organizações da sociedade civil. Então, para além de fazer comunicados de imprensa, nós temos que ter coragem. Se há uma violação de direitos humanos efetiva, temos que ter coragem de levar o caso ao tribunal. Temos que ter coragem de levar os casos à Comissão de Direitos Humanos existente em cada país. Temos que ter coragem de alterar o debate da Assembleia da República, o debate do Parlamento, e dizer que não, o que vocês estão a discutir não é prioritário agora. Prioritário é este assunto de não podermos manifestar. É este assunto de direitos humanos que está a ser recorrente. Senhores, ponham na mesa o assunto de direitos humanos e decidirmos os temas. Debatam esse assunto. E vamos com força. Por que não vão debater? Porque nós, se eles não debater, vamos lhes tirar o salário. Ok? Estamos num período, por exemplo, em Moçambique, estamos num período crucial. Mas ninguém está a explorar. Um período crucial para os políticos. É um país, é um período eleitoral. Em outubro temos eleições. Tudo vão fazer para ter os nossos votos. Então, é um período que estão a pedir tudo. Então, é um período para nós também exigirmos. Para exigirmos. Para reabilitarem tudo. Para mudar tudo. Ou não vamos votar. Nós até não nos manifestar. Podemos, como organização civil, dizer: senhores, se não melhorar...
Actually, I do have roots in Botswana. My grandfather is from Botswana, so you are not too far off. Mary, you wanted to make an intervention. Go for it, please.
Yes, thanks, Bonolo. It's just that when João was speaking about the institutions and the law, and I mean, I know he's an advocate, so obviously that's his first point of call. But we also have to understand that in my country, for example, and I think it's happening in other parts of the continent as well, that the legal systems are being weaponized against human rights defenders as well. I made an example of these members of parliament, but then I want to bring into light what is currently happening. You know, when that terrorist attack happened in the United States of America, we never ever thought it would come to bite us in such a way, you know, because every country went around then promulgating and enacting laws against terrorism, because there was now this new fear that there'd be terrorist attacks all around the world. But in our country, the Suppression of Terrorism Act is being used to target human rights defenders. You have a political party that has been proscribed as a terrorist entity in the country. So if you're a member of that political party, basically you're a terrorist. And with what has been happening lately, activists and human rights defenders have been termed as being terrorists. You know, it's being said that we don't have freedom fighters in the country, we don't have activists in the country, rather we have terrorists who want to see an overthrow of the government. And these human rights defenders and activists are being arrested and charged under this act, being denied bail. And their cases are not taking off. Some of them were arrested in 2021. Their cases haven't taken off just yet. And the lawyers that are being targeted for assassination are the very same lawyers who are representing these that have been arrested. So you get to see that your law may work in a system where the separation of powers is clear. In 1973, not only was political participation and political parties banned, but the king assumed all powers. So we live in an absolute monarchy. It's a dictatorship. He has all executive powers, legislative powers, and judicial powers, which means if he controls all three arms of government, they cannot function independently from each other. And this plays out in a very simple way. In the executive, he appoints the ministers, the prime minister, the ministers. The constitution is clear on how it has to be done, but he doesn't follow the constitution on how it has to be done. The judiciary, he appoints judges. Again, the constitution is clear, but he flouts the constitution. We've had members of the JSC who are supposed to recommend judges to the High Court and the Supreme Court, actually telling us that they too wake up to surprising news that a new judge has been appointed. So you see how it works out. In Parliament, he appoints at the minimum 1/3 of the Parliament, either of the two houses. And you know that in order for a resolution to pass in Parliament, you've got to have a 2/3. Already he's guaranteed that 1/3, you know, and with the way our system is run, the other 2/3, most of them are compromised, are loyalists, are traditionalists and stuff like that. So it would work. We were having a conversation at the Commission, Bonolo, to say, well, at least there's an article that came out to say South Africa is a failed state because of the current problems that are there. But we are arguing and saying, well, it's not failed yet. You know, it's because if there's one thing that you guys do have, is a functioning legal system that cannot be, it may be influenced but cannot be controlled by anyone. So I think, you know, when we discuss these things and look at them, we look at them from different contexts. And when we agitate for activism, we from different contexts. And the fear of self as well. You know, we are very afraid of standing out there, like João has said. We're very afraid of coming out strongly. We hide behind social media, and then those that are able to stand out are the ones that, you know, are killed and face all the risks and threats that we're talking about. Thanks, Monola.
Thank you. I like that somebody actually accused me of having traces of South African exceptionalism. and I took it. I think it's part of our story, and I agree with you, Mary, that and particularly as South African, because of this sense of exceptionalism, we tend to exaggerate things. Not that we're invalidating our experiences, but at least we have laws that slightly better than it is in most countries. And Tobekile, perhaps it may be helpful for you to start from that point that Mary made about the king and, you know, having power over all arms and legs of government, and make a reflection how that looks like in your country, in Zimbabwe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Podolo, and thanks to the speakers who went before me. So it makes it quite easy and comfortable for me to just flow with the, you know, with the vibes that are already ongoing. So I'll talk about. Okay, I know you want me to start from where Mary left, talking about power, of course, control, being all settled in one force, the king, etc. And I think, looking at the Zimbabwean context, you find that we have, of course, the ruling party and ZANU-PF, the new dispensation, which is not so new after the coup, which was not a coup. You know, there are all of these funny ways of phrasing what's happening in the country. You find that in the Zimbabwean context, we have, of course, the imbalance politically, where, you know, in the lawmaking process, laws can simply, you know, be enacted, and you wake up one morning, you are wondering, where are we even going as a country with the legislative reforms that are happening, which are actually targeting human rights defenders and not bringing any freshness with regards to promoting and protecting human rights. So that is something that we're experiencing in the country, where we also, you know, are concerned about a number of legislative provisions that are not adding value, but are actually posing much threat and much problems to the human rights discourse. But just maybe going to my own floor of things, I just wanted to start from, you know, highlighting the state of things in Zimbabwe and flashing back to as far back as, there's some feedback, I'm not so sure if it's because of this thing or something. I keep hearing something going, how do I turn it off? Thanks, thank you. I still hear it. Hi. Maybe that's better. I still hear it. So anyway, I'll just proceed. As long as it's not annoying anybody else, I'll handle it. So I'll just flash back to 2013, when we had a constitution that's still being considered as new to date, probably because of non-implementation of, you know, some of what is entrenched within itself. So we had this constitution that came into force in 2013, and one of the critical things that the constitution of 2013 was doing was to provide, of course, for socioeconomic rights over and above the civil and political rights which were provided for, you know, to some extent in the previous constitution. Apart from that, one critical thing that I want to center on is, you know, the provision that was there that was saying that, at least with this election that we are anticipating in 2023, because we're in an election season, we are going to vote. The date is not yet known, I don't know it, and somehow one person seems to know the date. It's still a mystery, but we are going to have an election, right? So what happened was that the 2013 constitution was making a provision that for the first time in history in the Zimbabwean context, the electorate were going to vote for vice presidents. And we're super excited. Personally, being a citizen of Zimbabwe, I was looking forward to voting for the vice president, apart from voting for the president, because it sort of like gave some level of hope that, okay, fine, we've been struggling with trying to, have someone else, a freshness in terms of a new political vibe within the executive. So we're looking forward to perhaps we're going to succeed with, at least with the VPs. And guess what? When we had the coup, which was not a coup in 2017, you find that we went to the elections in 2018, and there was now a new dispensation led by, of course, the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. And what happened is that when he came into power, of course, apart from the blatant extrajudicial killings that then followed with the new dispensation in August 2018, where 6 people were killed, and there was a Motlanthe commission appointed to investigate this. This is killing me. I don't know. Can we fix it? Is this better? Yes. Wow, I think I got the bad one. Thanks, Mary. So what happened then is that after the extrajudicial killings happened, you find that was one dimension that came with the new dispensation. But apart from that, one worrying thing was the hunger and the thirst within the executive or the government to change legislation or to transform legislation in a way that was bringing in repression. And we saw that with a number of constitutional amendments to the 2013 Constitution, which, amendments have changed the political discourse. So now we have an election that is coming up, the date unknown, remember what I said earlier. And with this new amendment, there was an amendment, Constitutional Amendment number 2, which then brought in, or rather reversed the gains of, some of the gains of the 2013 Constitution and wiped off that provision that we could now vote for vice presidents. I mentioned that because we're in election season, and that upsets me a lot, because I was really looking forward to voting this time, not just for the president, but for the VP. But what am I saying with this? I'm leading to a conversation where I just want to show you that it's not just one isolated incident of amending the Constitution, which is supposed to be sacrosanct, a supreme law of the land. But it follows a trend where we now see other pieces of legislation being proposed and aiming at repressing, fundamental rights and freedoms, apart from political rights being affected. So what I'm going to talk about is what I'm going to talk about under the banner of the travesty of justice in the Zimbabwean context. And when you're looking at the rule of law itself in Zimbabwe, you'd find that it's something that we've been discussing over the past years as human rights defenders in the country, to say there's no rule of law. But what we are seeing within the new dispensation is more of threats by law, because there's been a lot of threats that have been issued by the government against human rights defenders. And one of those major threats comes in the form of the PVO bill. I think there's been a lot of discussion around the PVO bill, which is a private voluntary organization bill, which seeks to essentially, extinguish the existence of, organizations that are not registered as private voluntary organizations, because NGOs have been operating in Zimbabwe as trusts and common law universities, as well as registered PVOs. So now they are, there's a serious concern within the civil society in the country, and that has also been a cause for fragmentation as well within civil society, where there's not been a common voice because of what is at stake with regards to waking up one morning as an NGO and you're extinguished, you cannot operate. So there's been that concern as well, where civil society has been thinking, how do we remain sustainable if this thing comes into force? And right now that PVO bill is just waiting for the signature by the president, and it's lingering on the heads of civil society. Are we going to remain sustainable? Are we going to continue in operation? What's going to happen when that thing is signed? And one of the things that PVO bill does, of course, is it increases rather the intensity of surveillance. It increases the intensity of monitoring by, state security, by the government itself with regards to operations of civil society and with regards to how, civil society organizations associate. And in the past, we've seen even civil society actors going to associate with other organizations elsewhere and arriving in the country and being arrested for being in particular meetings. And that is a very critical cause for concern. So you can imagine with the PVO, it's going to demand a whole lot, sharing, of plans. What are you doing in this year? Disclosing everything that you're doing, and probably it's going to also put human rights defenders more and more at risk, and that is something that is particularly worrying. Because of the funding issue, I think earlier, in one of the remarks, there was a discussion, I think it was you, Bonolo, who mentioned this in your opening, keynote about, the funding that is there for civil society organizations to continue in operations. And that is something that also has been a major concern when looking at as well the PVO bill, because now organizations will have to disclose where their money is coming from, and to that extent as well, to also continue in existence, organizations, some have begun to consider perhaps let's just, follow through with what the government is saying, and yet there's need for a more consolidated voice, more solidarity in terms of, a strategy to actually, map the way forward with regards to sustainability, as well as even challenging that law, whether it's signed or it's not signed. Even if it comes into force, it's still a bad law that needs to be challenged, and there's need for solidarity within the CSO space to be able to make sure that what we get in the future is something that enables civil society to operate and opens up the civic space, so to speak. I've talked about, change in legislation. I've mentioned the PVO bill. I'll also talk about patriotism. There's this thing called patriotism. I don't know how you force patriotism. Literally, it's just something that I'm trying to, battle with when I'm thinking about my government, when it thinks about this and it says, yeah, patriotism, and it's a good thing. So we've had discussions, I think, in the past years about, from the time when, the government was issuing these threats. When I started, I talked about threats that are there, threats by law. And, right now there is a criminal law code amendment bill which seeks to bring in a provision, and I'll read the provision and what it says. It will create the crime of willfully damaging the sovereignty and national interests of Zimbabwe. I don't even know what that means, right? I'm, again, battling with that concept about, okay, fine, is this the thing that my government is creating? Because like right now, probably I'm doing what this thing doesn't want me to do. I'm already at risk. So if this thing comes into force, what does that mean for my mere existence as a human being, or rather as a citizen of the country? Which makes me ask the question, who are human rights for? Because we are a state party to a number of instruments, including the ICCPR, the ICESCR. We are a state party to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So what does that mean that we are a state parties to these things? We actually have a constitution which talks about freedom of assembly and association. It talks about freedom of expression, meaning I can express myself the way I like, as long as, of course, I do not violate other people's rights. But at this point in time, when I'm talking about the negatives that my country is rolling out, repressing human rights defenders, why then should I be arrested for it when the Constitution provides for freedom of expression? Who is that right for if it's not for a human being and if it's not for me? So that is something that I really am concerned about. So you can imagine, at some point when the government was talking about the Patriot Bill, we were thinking as civil society, maybe they're going to call it the Patriot Bill, but there's no such thing right now. What they've done is they've couched it in such a way that it reads Criminal Law Code Amendment Bill, and within its text, it covers a number of other issues which have got nothing to do with patriotism. Another provision talks about rape and things like that. But within that thing, you find something that is saying, well, willfully damaging the sovereignty and national interests of Zimbabwe. And one of the things that is described as being part of that is subverting national interest and things like that, which is subject to, interpretation. You choose your own interpretation. So how do we know to what state security is going to, assign as an interpretation of this provision? Nobody knows, but definitely you can imagine this is going to be used to criminalize, the work that, the wonderful work rather, that human rights defenders, are doing in the country. Already with the current position, the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Act in Zimbabwe has a provision that is called subverting a constitutionally elected government, which has been used to criminalize what HRIDs do. I will cite an example of Pride Mukono, who is still facing that charge for I think over 2 or 3 years now, for what he said on social media, and or rather, I'm actually not so sure what his defense was on this one, but I know that it was based on a tweet that was allegedly something that he said on social media platforms, just expressing dissent, and then you find yourself arrested for subverting. That's a very big term. I mean, honestly, I'm a lawyer by profession, so even I am battling with what does that even mean, subverting a constitutionally elected. How do you subvert it? I'm just going on my business and I'm making a comment on social media. And I know earlier we had a conversation about hiding behind social media. I'm a digital rights activist, so I'm big on social media. So for me, I love an open space on social media for people to freely hide there and express themselves. But guess what? Even the government have come to speed with this thing, that social media is a powerful weapon. It's a powerful tool for activism. That's why you find the NSAS protests. You find how impactful it was. Twitter has been shut down in Nigeria because of the power of social media. The internet has been shut down in Eswatini. It has been disrupted, throttled. The internet has been shut down in Zimbabwe in the new dispensation. In January 2019, there was a fuel price hike that was announced by the president, the new president in the country. And what then happened from his mere pronouncement, there was a protest that went amok, and over 1,800 human rights violations were documented. At that time, I was working for Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, and I was part of that documentation process, where we recorded numerous violations, including 17 extrajudicial killings. So you can imagine what was happening at that time. But this arose as well from the fact that there was, sharing of information. I think 3 days after that process happens, we have the arrest of Ivan Mawarire for a post that was happening on social media. So I just want to highlight the importance of social media, and it's a conversation. Even as human rights defenders, we need to begin to interrogate, to say, okay, how can we make use of social media to advance our causes? And not just that, how can we be safe online when we are doing what we do? Because most of the arrests that have been happening, even the political prisoners as well, that we are looking at in the country in Zimbabwe, they are political prisoners because of what they have said on social media platforms, be it Twitter, be it Facebook, be it WhatsApp. There are people who have been arrested. Even a nurse was arrested for speaking against, working conditions within the country, socioeconomic issues in the country, because the economy is on a downturn. And the nurse faced an arrest and a charge based on, inciting violence or whatever the charge was, having to do with, of course, the common charges are inciting public violence. The other one is publishing falsehoods. And I'll explain to you what the problem is with these two things as I continue to talk about legislation in the country. So you find that when the nurse expressed herself about, what she was not happy with, in a WhatsApp post, this communication was taken, obviously presented to the police, blah, blah, blah. But my point is that, again, the Constitution of Zimbabwe has a fundamental right. It talks about privacy and privacy of communications, which is something that social media is now doing. It's giving us a platform to interact, to communicate, and our privacy of communications is guaranteed in terms of our Zimbabwean constitution. But you find that what you say sometimes, even in a WhatsApp group, can be taken and handed over to the police. You might find yourself being arrested. And this has been also the case in Malawi. There's been numerous cases that we have documented as an organization around what's been happening on social media and people who have been arrested for what they say in WhatsApp groups. And that in itself violates what is called encryption. When you know on WhatsApp, it's end-to-end encryption, your communications should be private. But that kind of communication is being used to victimize human rights defenders. So you should be worried if you are on WhatsApp as a human rights defender. You should be concerned if you're a human rights defender who is on Twitter. You should be concerned if you're a human rights defender who is on Facebook, because what you say, you might just be arrested tomorrow. Particularly if you're in my country, there's enough ammunition from the state through the law that can cause you to be actually arrested. So that makes me talk about privacy, freedom of expression, and access to information. I hope I still have time because I can do this the whole day. How many? Okay, fine. I'm being told I've got 3 minutes. I thought I had 30 minutes, but where is my 30 minutes? So yeah, there's now in our country, I was talking about specific legislative reforms from the constitutional amendment and the things that have been changed. I've talked about the PVO bill. I've talked about the Patriot bill that comes in the form of an amendment to the criminal law code. I'll talk about the Cyber and Data Protection Act, which is a new law that came into effect in December 2021. And what it does is, it's a law that's meant to offer protection for personal data and personal information. So you find that in December 2021, when that law was passed, it was actually titled the Data Protection Law, and its main objective was data protection. But then I think in March they had another reflection or a premonition, and they were like, no, but wait a minute, we need to change this thing and give it a new title, and they rephrased it to Cyber and Data Protection Act. And the objective changed from the objective of protection of personal data to the objective of cybersecurity. Now that means something that is very critical. If you look at it critically, it's not just a minor change, but what it simply meant was that there's more prioritization of cybersecurity. Then we'll discuss fundamental rights later. And you'd find that this portion that addresses cybersecurity in that whole law is a very small portion, but the bulk of it is actually data protection. So it actually baffles me why that actually had to happen that way. But nevertheless, one of the key things that law does is that it amends the Interception of Communications Act and creates what is called the Cybersecurity and Monitoring of Interception of Communications Center, which shall be an established unit in the Office of the President, which shall be called the Cybersecurity and Monitoring of Interception of Communication Center. Now, this center is empowered to give advice to service providers. So service providers are your telcos, right? Those are the people who monitor your communications. So again, this is a cause for concern when we're looking at human rights defenders, because like I said, today in the digital age, people are engaging online. Yes, we will do our press releases and post them on our websites, but we are on Twitter, we are making comments, we are on WhatsApp groups, we are making calls and everything. So if you know that you have such a similar law in your country, you should be concerned. And as an HRD, you need to know who is monitoring your communications. What kind of monitoring scenario do we have going on in the country? And I will talk about, of course, surveillance technologies, being deployed with no clarity as well, and no clarity as to procurement processes in the country. We've got a lot of deployment of Chinese technologies that are being used for surveillance purposes. We've got cameras being put at different intersections in the city. It's not clear for what reasons. But I think one MP at some point, I think a couple of years back in Zimbabwe, was arrested, and her defense was that she had been abducted, and the government starts pulling out the CCTVs and footage and says, no, were you really there? This is what happened. But what that did for us as digital rights actors was to show us that surveillance technologies are not being deployed for any good intent. We actually need to understand why surveillance technologies are being bought or procured by our countries and for what purposes. And like I mentioned, we've got people like Jacob Ngarivume, who was recently sentenced to a prison term of at least 3 years imprisonment for something that he said on Twitter, urging people to protest. But look here, like I said, who are human rights for if not humans? The fundamental freedom to protest is provided for in the Constitution. And it should only follow that if you are going to protest, you need to mobilize for the protest. So if you cannot then say, let's protest, then what use is the right? Who is it for? You get what I mean? So you find that he's facing a prison sentence as we speak for something that he said on Twitter. Remember what I said about the power of social media and where we are conducting our work as HRDs. It's not just offline. We have transitioned. The train has left the station. We are doing our work on social media, and social media needs to be a safe space. And we need as well the internet to be open. In 2019, the government of Zimbabwe shut down the internet. And last year, again, they throttled the internet ahead of a Yellow Sunday protest that was planned by the CCC opposition party. So now the government is really alert that the train has left the station. HRDs are engaging on social media platforms, and there is now a deeper hunger to actually limit and shrink the space, not just offline, but as well as online. So this is something that we need to look out for. I will then wind off, I wanted to talk about, of course, the targeting of journalists, but I'll draw, apart from talking about Hope Ochungono, I'll leverage on, the Malawi case of Gregory Gondwe, who was arrested and, last year, and, his digital technologies were seized and things like that. So you find that, again, we have this as well in Zimbabwe, where we have the government just seizing property and trying to search our digital technologies, etc. So again, in the civil society space or in the human rights defending work, we need to be able to get what we need to be able to protect ourselves, not just offline but online, but also to secure our digital technologies. I'll end with just key recommendations as I conclude my remarks that, what I think is a way forward is that there's need for more consensus building around key issues within CSOs to tackle campaigns, and also to petition the government beyond just our press releases. I think that's already been mentioned. We've seen litigation as well work in certain instances. I think in 2019, when we had an internet shutdown, we had Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights, file a case before the High Court. Of course, it was a win on a technicality, but it did not pronounce on the constitutional issue of promoting freedom of expression. But we are hoping that, in this coming election, the government does not, shut down the internet and put a cap to freedom of expression and access to information, which is key, especially around elections. And as well, advocating for national strategies is important as civil society as well. National strategies that guarantee online freedoms and the responsible and ethical use of digital technologies to avoid technology being used as a tool to increase surveillance on human rights defenders. I mentioned surveillance technologies, so I think definitely there's something that we need to consider, looking at where the world is going, the use of artificial intelligence, targeting people. We need more responsible and ethical use of digital technologies. I will also recommend as well for, like I mentioned, HRDs, the civic organizations, CSOs, to reflect that offline, to be able to reflect deeply on how we've transitioned from the offline spaces to also program within their work online rights, because I think definitely everything that we do offline, we can enjoy it online, and we need that space to also remain open and not to be extinguished, so to speak. And I've got 3 things. I'm almost done, Bonolo, and I feel your eye is so intense. So yeah, digital security strengthening at personal and organizational level is key for our existence as CSOs. It's something that I picked as well, again, from a colleague, Gregory Gondwe, from the Malawian context, the need for strengthening of our personal and organizational security when we're looking at digital technologies, and also finding allies within the human rights HRD movement. Sometimes we think that this is just peculiar to CSOs, but we need to have a consolidated voice, bring in the media, find an area of common ground, and come up with advocacy strategies that meet our joint vision and joint purpose, so that we're able to be a bigger mass to address our challenges. I don't know in other countries, but in my country as well, leveraging the national human rights institutions to advance the cause. It's not a great win for us, but we've had times when definitely the commission in the country has been able to pronounce on key things and make critical recommendations. And also leveraging, again, on AU mechanisms such as PAP, African Commission, to echo key concerns and urging the ratification as well of key instruments and protocols, such as the Malawi Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection, and the African Court Protocol, and the declaration that ensures that CSOs can access at the African Court to file complaints. It's something that we don't have the luxury of. I always envy my colleagues in West Africa, because when Twitter, for instance, in Nigeria, I work for an organization with a headquarter, which is headquartered in Nigeria, and I envy my colleagues because we were able to file a case before ECOWAS to get a determination that banning the Twitter was an affront to freedom of expression and access to information. But in SADC, we do not have that luxury after, of course, the tribunal was disbanded. So we need to continue to advocate, at least for now, for ratification of the relevant protocols that and the declaration that allows us to file cases before the African Court. And definitely I'm big on coalition building. So there's need for coalition action, harnessing the power of collaboration to actually interrogate human rights infractions that we're facing. I hope I've painted a beautiful picture of my country, Zimbabwe. I'm pro Zimbabwe, I'm Pan-African.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that you've mentioned that I found interesting is this idea that the law is being used as a tool to repress, opposition voices, and that's how impunity works. But also this idea that as human rights issues in the SADC region are quite transnational, right? So to some degree, our issues are the same. So it may even be a lot easier for us to create linkages. And it goes back to something that Mary spoke about earlier, that when we think about people-to-people solidarity, the fact that our national issues, or rather issues in the region, are transnational, and therefore that it may be a lot easier for us to create linkages. But the fact that the law has been used to repress opposition voices, I think that's also a gap for us as human rights defenders to think about ways in which I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just a mere political scientist who's displaced in a law space. Don't ask me how I got here. But I think it may be another area for us to think about. How do we respond to such things? I know Joang has to rush. He's got a flight to catch. So I'm going to open up a space for questions. If you have a question for him specifically, I will give you the floor now. If no one has a question for him, thank you so much, my brother. It was good to see you, and we appreciate you making time. We don't want you to miss your flight. But Tariro Yanga, do we have a mic? We have, okay. Questions, interventions, can I see anyone? Okay, I see a hand there at the back. Okay, you go for it.
Thank you very much. Emmanuel is my name, from Swaziland. On this last presentation, with these laws that are being proposed, are they not against the Constitution itself? And how do we then, as Zimbabweans, deal with, for example, the complicated law that you referred to, where the state can actually arrest you because it considers whatever you are doing to be subversive or undermining the state, and so forth and so on. So how do we then survive if the Constitution provides us, on the one hand, the rights, and then on the other hand, you have a situation where there are laws that are made against the very Constitution? So I'm really begging in my mind, how do you survive as civil society actors with this law that is being the PVO law? My king was in your country to get some notes on this law in particular, because they are talking about it. At most, they are always now on media, government officials saying NGOs are financing terrorism, and I'm sure that, and then I'm sure that they want that template now to put the law so that it can control the organization. So how do we deal with this regression, as it were, in our region, where the people are really deprived of rights? Your country is on one hand begging the West to lift sanctions But its behavior, because the sanctions are trying to mobilize and motivate them towards a human rights-centered governance. But they are they are going the other way around. But on the other hand, you find South Africa also saying lift sanctions in Zimbabwe, but they're not saying reform and behave. Thank you.
So I'm glad you've mentioned the aspect of, other African, SADC leaders saying, nah, lift up the sanctions instead of calling out Zimbabwe, which I'm glad to call it the brotherhood, because it cannot be a sisterhood, right? I mean, how? Because the same frustration you're feeling is, I feel it, I don't know how many times more, because I am a citizen in that country, right? And this is something that's ongoing, and it's an affront clearly to fundamental rights and freedoms. And from the onset, I highlighted we are state party to a number of key instruments. It's mind-boggling. Nobody in their rightful sense would create such a provision that doesn't make sense. And mind you, because you are definitely a foreign agent, I will label you that, because the criminal law code amendment bill says that if I am going to speak to a foreign agent about the lifting of sanctions or the lack thereof of their being lifted, what I'm doing is I'm subverting. Right at this point in time, if that thing was a law, it's a good thing the law does not apply in retrospect. But I'm trying to demonstrate to you how ridiculous this thing is. So ideally, civil society organizations will have meetings with USAID, will have meetings with the European Union, we'll have a conversation about the environment, we'll summarize what the state of digital rights and, the state of human rights is. I'm a digital rights practitioner, I was going in another direction. We'll have that conversation. But if you are so unlucky that in that meeting there's state security, and they record that you had this meeting, or somehow the eyes of technology deployed in different spaces catch that you had this engagement with a foreign agent, you will be charged and liable to 20 years imprisonment, literally. That's the maximum you can get. That's how baffling such a law is. So we will have to wait until maybe perhaps I get arrested for it. Then maybe we'll test the Constitutional Court, because it's not a law yet. It's waiting. It's still going through the lawmaking process. It's been gazetted. So if it passes, and we've seen things pass that we were thinking they would never pass, like Constitutional Amendment number 2, which was seeking to trash, and we went out into communities, we mobilized and said, this is the thing. This thing is ridiculous. And there were constitutional hearings. I mean, the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee went around the country. At that time, I was, again, working with Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. We went into communities and mobilized, and we monitored what happened. And for us, the view was that, people say no to this thing, but it sailed through. It sailed through. So you find that we don't know, but it could sail through. And if it sailed through, definitely it's something that we're saying we need solidarity to make noise about such things. Because one thing that happens in Zimbabwe, like you're saying, it's precedent. It's a template. It will be implemented in each and every country. In fact, when you're looking at the PVO bill, you find that this CSO thing, it started in Malawi. There was a law on it's sounding ridiculous again, and it's just like the trend. So if you don't cut the wings of some of this bad practice or bad legislation in the wings, then it's what it is. But like I said, beyond our constitutional courts, we do not have the luxury. This is why I mentioned the SADC tribunal being disbanded, because beyond that, having exhausted, if we exhaust, when I've been arrested, of course, for subverting, and we exhaust all, avenues at in the national courts, in the judiciary in Zimbabwe, where to next is the question. We don't have a SADC tribunal. If we had an ECOWAS, I'm big on ECOWAS. I'm from SADC, but I love ECOWAS. I have to say, it's the one that has pronounced on internet shutdown as a violation of freedom of expression. It has done this thing on Twitter. But we don't have that in SADC. So we have each other, basically, or we are at the whims of our governments.
Thank you. I think I see your hand. You had it, yeah. I think it's also very important also mentioning how neighboring countries can step in. I mean, I particularly struggle with the way South Africa responds to issues in Zimbabwe in particular. Fikile Mbalula, is he our General Secretary now? Made a silly comment at the end of the ANC's electoral conference that the ANC will not support a regime change in Zimbabwe. And I mean, there's a whole lot of other issues there with the standard in South Africa is that the ANC/government will choose diplomatic relations over anything, right? And that statement on its own that they would not support a regime change in Zimbabwe, but completely ignoring the realities of Zimbabwe, it's very, very problematic. I'm going to, I see Yanga had a hand, I see my brother from Swaziland had a hand, I see my sister from Zimbabwe had a hand, I see. So we're running out of time, so please keep your questions quite brief, and I'll ask that Mary and Tobekile, if you can keep them brief. I'm going to start with, yeah.
Okay, so sorry. Okay, so thank you to our speakers. And I think for me, as someone who's big on multiple strategies, we are here talking about the law and how the law is being weaponized and being used against us. But what else can we do? How are we building movements on the ground also? What can we learn from our liberation histories? Because when you look at our liberation histories, people still manage to organize in very repressive, environments. And I think we find ourselves there again. So what can we learn? What can we learn from other, from other uprisings, and then how do we use the law, and also how do we continue building on the ground? And I say this because I think right now in Zimbabwe, like that, what has been highlighted, our courts are captured, and so how do we build the power of people to actually be able to do, something big? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Bonolo, and thank you to the panelists for the inputs they've made. I think she has just taken the first question that I had. I think, but secondly, I think it's a comment around the issue of the deliberate weakening of state institutions, oversight institutions like your human rights commissions, the courts, and other accountability institutions, which we see as a deliberate ploy by the regimes in the region, and it's been a trend across countries within Africa and the region, and SADC to be more specific. But I also want to ask around what other strategies can civil society use to navigate around such a space where also the weakening of these institutions also impact negatively on the work of civil society organizations? How can we then best, organize and be able to push back under those circumstances as civil society organizations? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for both of you ladies. Thank you very much for your presentations. I think especially the Swaziland contextualization, for me specifically, I did not realize just truly how dire the situation is there. And Mary, thank you very much for bringing that into light. Mary, a question for you. In terms of now the practicalities of this conversation, which is under the guise of the state of human rights and CSO interventions, I want to bring in our relevant regional organizations that should be involved in this conversation, and how I wish they were in this room with us to talk about this very important matter, particularly with the African Union and SADC. One of the biggest things that these regional organizations pride themselves on is the prioritization of state sovereignty over domestic issues. The big logical thinking behind it is it's some sort of a decolonial protest against the West that has always told African countries how to govern in their states. And so there is a constant prioritization within these regional blocs and within the African Union itself that people must take care of their own business, right? But also at the same time, what coexists is this prioritization of peace and security and good governance. And you have this conflicting coexistence of these blocs that want this peace and security and good governance, and yet most of the time the stances that they have towards almost any conflict is that of sovereignty is more important than whatever conclusions we want to draw from the domestic issues. What do you think we can do as civil society to highlight that in this particular case in Swaziland, sovereignty is harming the country. The help is needed. The prioritization of that peace and security and good governance is very important. Now, that's a very big question, but I'm hoping you can try to give insight regarding that. And then, Tobekile, the question I have for you has to do with an anecdotal point you made regarding surveillance laws. I think there's an increasing trend globally that governments just in general have got this hesitation with where social media is going and how there's even possibilities that other governments can spy through other people through their social media platforms, et cetera, et cetera. But I just want you to maybe zone in again on what you had spoken about on the differences between data protection and cybersecurity in relation to state priorities. I'd really like that to be unpacked a bit more. Thank you.
Muito obrigada pela palavra. Eu não tenho uma pergunta como tal, mas estou aqui a trazer uma pequena reflexão. Se atualmente a situação dos direitos humanos está assim para as pessoas sem deficiência, imaginem só como é que está a situação para as pessoas com deficiência. Principalmente num país em que existem leis discriminatórias, leis que proíbem as pessoas com deficiência, por exemplo, de contraírem o matrimônio, leis que, por exemplo, proíbem as pessoas com deficiência psicossocial de votar, inibem a participação política da pessoa com deficiência. Eu só pedi a palavra mesmo para trazer esta reflexão. A situação é muito crítica e principalmente para as pessoas com deficiência. A nível do Fórum das Associações Moçambicanas de Pessoas com Deficiência, estamos a advocar, estamos a trabalhar no sentido de reverter esta situação. Mas não está a ser fácil, não está a ser fácil. Sabemos que Moçambique ratificou a Convenção das Nações Unidas sobre os Direitos das Pessoas com Deficiência já há 10 anos, mas a domesticação desta convenção ainda é uma situação muito difícil. Mas está em processo agora a elaboração de uma proposta de lei específica que versa sobre a deficiência. Porém, é uma lei que está muito aquém daquilo que são os direitos das pessoas com deficiência. Portanto, continuamos a trabalhar para que esta proposta de lei seja revista de tal forma que refleta os anseios das pessoas com deficiência e respeite os padrões de direitos humanos, tal como recomenda a Convenção das Nações Unidas sobre os Direitos das Pessoas com Deficiência. Muito obrigada pelo espaço, eu só queria trazer esta reflexão.
Eu queria... obrigada, eu disse que era Lídia, mas eu queria aqui falar de alguns aspectos que eu achei que são comuns quando tivemos a apresentação da SADC, de Zimbábue e de Moçambique. Nenhum dos países disse que não tinha a legislação. Especialmente em Moçambique, onde eu vivo, temos uma legislação muito invejável, muito boa, rico. Mas o problema é, depois daquilo que o nosso irmão aqui estava a dizer, ele mesmo e nós, já em algum momento levantamos algum problema que pudesse ser verificado que existe uma lei estabelecida em Moçambique, mas deve ser cumprida, porque a característica de qualquer legislação, a sua obrigação, o seu cumprimento é obrigatório. Então, nós também, como organizações da sociedade civil, quando nós reclamamos ou falamos, há aqueles polícias que vêm e dizem que receberam uma ordem para nos mandar parar. Então, nunca paramos procurar saber receberam de quem, porque eles vêm com uma força física ou são polícias com balas e nós temos medo porque vemos os nossos irmãos a morrer. A outra coisa é que, se não morreu, vai ter problemas de represália no sítio onde você vive. O que é que nós, como países, vamos fazer por forma a fortificar esta união? Porque nós temos a legislação que nos manda, em caso de esgotar todos os procedimentos nacionais, continuarmos com outros procedimentos regionais. Então, o que é que nós fazemos? Na verdade, quando estiveram a apresentar aqui os seus argumentos, eu me senti culpada, porque em algum momento nós temos processos que não andam por causa do sistema sistema jurídico em Moçambique, que não tem celeridade nos processos. Não é a culpa dos defensores dos direitos humanos, porque temos um caminho, temos que seguir até o processo terminar. Temos uma pessoa que tem mandato na Assembleia da República, mas tem um problema que nós submetemos. Esse problema não está a ter uma solução, está parado, está a terminar o mandato. Vamos fazer o que também? O problema é o sistema que não deixa aqueles três, o executivo, o parlamentar e justiça, a trabalhar de forma independente. E nós respondemos, como sociedade civil, para todos os que estão como cidadãos nesse determinado país. Então, vamos aqui nos dotar de força maior. O que é que vamos fazer para um follow-up para os assuntos submetidos no tribunal? Qual é a forma de fazer respeitar os direitos humanos em caso de submissão de um processo de violação de menor, violação de um cidadão, violação dos direitos do deficiente? Todos têm direitos fundamentais e direitos humanos. Obrigado.
I'm going to give both of you an opportunity to respond to the questions and to give your final remarks. 3 minutes each. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonolo. I think there was a question about what else can we do apart from using the law in advancing our work. But I think, one, we have to create strong collaborations between the institutions that we're part of, the organizations that we're part of. And I think this is just a point in action, you know, like this training that we're having right now. It's a collaboration between 3 organizations that are bringing human rights defenders from different countries to better enhance their capacity to deal with the threats against them using the kind of mechanisms that we're talking about, the Pan-African Parliament. The second one is the solidarity that we spoke to. The statements are important, the people-to-people solidarity. There's no magic formula. It's just a lot of hard work that we have to do. I cannot overemphasize the issue of advocacy, which talks to the 2 previous points I've made. I know advocacy at some point, we get tired, we get despondent, we don't see the results, but advocacy is always a long-term game. It's not a short sprint, it's a marathon. It will take a long time for us to get to the finish post, but eventually we will get there. So the advocacy has to continue regardless of the prevailing circumstances. And of course, creating networks within which to work. Right here, we've got Southern Defenders, which is the regional network. We've got the Mozambique Human Rights Defenders Network. In our own countries, we need to have the networks as well. This is to provide support and assistance to human rights defenders doing their work, either human rights defenders as an individual or the organization, because organizations also are attacked. And then one of the things that I think Thabo mentioned that governments are intentionally weakening the institutions. For us with our NHRI in my country, it's kind of like a sub-department of government, but we have to find a way of working with those institutions because they are supposed to be independent. So all these other institutions that are supposed to be independent, we need to form relationships with them and work with them, partner with them, and collaborate on areas of convergence, of course. It's not every area that we'll speak to. Then there was the direct question about regional bodies and regional mechanisms. I mean, we saw why the SADC tribunal was shut down. Zimbabweans, the Zimbabweans are guilty of shutting down. Okay, they used the tribunal and it was working for them. And our governments don't want to be held accountable. And therefore, in order not to be held accountable, they shut it down. That is why our governments are not depositing the declaration on the African Court, because the African Court has enforcement clauses within it. And ECOWAS has enforcement clauses within it, which is why it is effective. Now we are part of these other bodies, and we've got these treaties, and we subscribe to certain principles in these treaties, but there's nothing in there that says if you violate the very same principles that you have bound yourself to, what happens to you. So what we need to begin doing is, while we're agitating for the SADC tribunal to be brought back into force to work for the citizens, because that's what it's meant to do, we also have to work for enforcement clauses within the other treaties that says, if I am part of SADC and I have signed on to the good governance treaty, and I do not conform to this, in order for suspension to happen, these are the processes. The lawyers in the House can help. These are the processes. And if you fail to rectify by a certain period, we will suspend you, and you can be expelled. Some of us are now beginning to agitate. For example, I am beginning to agitate that no, Swaziland doesn't deserve to be part of these institutions because they don't conform and they don't believe in the principles that they tie themselves to. I've just come back from Banjul, the African Commission. What we saw with the death of Thulani is unprecedented. You had the AU issuing a statement. You had the African Commission issuing a statement. You had SADC issuing a statement. You had the UN and so many international bodies issuing statements. And with those statements, there was a clear call for an independent inquest to be held. And that is the work. What we're supposed to do is not let it slide. They've issued statements and we're sitting on our laurels and thinking that the government will take notice. They've issued the statement. We need to do the groundwork to ensure that what has been called for in those statements comes to fruition. The last issue that I want to talk to, in as much as it was a comment, but we are equally as guilty. Social inclusion doesn't ride high in our programs. We come and sit here and we make decisions and we make declarations or whatever we're going to do, but we are not representative. You know, we don't have people from, okay, maybe we have one from the LGBTI community, maybe we have one from, but we're not as inclusive as we should be. And I think, and this not only talks about people who have been classified in a certain way, but it also talks to the demographics. It talks to how many young people we have here, and the women that we have, how many are from the rural areas. Have we created an elitist club for ourselves where only us in the mainstream can access these kinds of platforms? So I think we need to look at social inclusion a bit more, apart from just looking at it from the gender lens and you know, the persons with disabilities. And lastly, she spoke about the law. Sometimes it's not the law per se that's a problem. It is how it is applied. Joan was talking about how you interpret things, and I think Tobegile also said we talk about how we interpret things. So when they interpret them in the negative, we can always interpret them in the positive and take it up whether through litigation or advocacy and see how far we go. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just address one aspect on cybersecurity and data protection. I think guidance has been given to states in terms of how they enact legislation, especially legislation that limits rights. The Syracuse principles are a go-to for that. They talk about national public interest, national interest. How do you limit a law? There should be, you know, there should be a law, first of all, pursuing a legitimate aim, and the measures used should be necessary, and the means used to limit that right should be proportionate. And cybersecurity definitely is a critical concern, because definitely there are cyber crimes. So when we are advocating for data protection and privacy respecting rights, we are not advocating for anything that is contrary to cybersecurity. What we are saying is fundamental rights start. The limitations follow, not the reverse, where we are seeing legislation being put in place to advance the limitations as opposed to advancing the fundamental rights and freedoms. So what we need centered are fundamental rights and freedoms, and privacy is central. So data protection should be top priority. And then cybersecurity is now there to limit rights. And when it's limiting rights, is it pursuing a legitimate aim? And what I was discussing as well in the legislation is that the laws that are in place, they are being used to target HRDs, and because of that, they fall short of being legitimate. They become illegitimate laws that are being enacted, and because of that, it falls away. So what we want is proper legislating that has a prioritization of fundamental rights and freedoms.
Thank you so much. I think this has been quite a rich discussion. I don't think we have any other question in the room. I'm going to ask Sheila to come make the lunch announcement, and there was something else.
Boa tarde a todos. Espero que tenham aproveitado esta sessão e tenhamos partilhado experiências e aquilo que são os nossos pensamentos em termos de melhorar a condição dos direitos humanos no nosso país. Como já não temos muito tempo, vamos passar para o nosso intervalo, onde vamos aproveitar para ter o nosso almoço, que vai ser servido no restaurante. Mas antes disso, gostaria de convidar a todos para uma foto de família que vai ser feita no jardim. Adicionalmente, gostaria de solicitar às pessoas que ainda não assinaram as listas de presenças, por favor, façam. É exatamente isso. Muito obrigada. Até já. Desculpa. É uma lista.